Hey there, everyone. Before we jump in, it's a fun idea if you tell us where you're from in the comments. Thanks. Remember to hit like and subscribe. Now let's get settled and begin. I always thought I'd know if she was cheating. It's funny how blind love can make you, how it can lull you into believing in the strength of a bond that's already crumbling beneath your feet. Every morning, I wake up next to her and she smiles like everything is perfect. I smile back. But inside, I'm already moving pieces on a chessboard she doesn't even know exists. It's not rage that drives me. No, anger is fleeting, reckless. I've thought this through. Revenge is a slow burn, a careful orchestration of consequences, and I'm playing the long game. It started with subtle shifts in her behavior, the kind I could have written off if I were weaker, if I didn't have the patience to look closer. Late nights at the office became more frequent, the important meetings a little too conveniently timed with her boss's business trips. At first, I let it pass. She was good at hiding the affair. I'll give her that. But no one is flawless. People slip, make mistakes. It's human nature. That's what I waited for. The mistake that would crack open the door to her secret. I found it eventually, a message on her phone. She had been careless, left it on the kitchen counter while making coffee one Sunday morning. A work email, she said. She was always good at lying. I'll give her that too. The message was from him, her boss. It was short, but it told me everything I needed to know. That was the moment the pieces fell into place. The long glances she thought I didn't notice. The night she came home a little too late, too flushed, too different. It wasn't the message that hurt the most. It was the realization of how easily she thought she could fool me. But I didn't confront her. Confrontation gives power to the accused. It turns their lie into something they can defend, explain away. No, I decided there and then that I would let her think she was safe, let her keep believing I was blind. While she continued her deceit, I began building my strategy, one small step at a time. I've never believed in half measures. Revenge, when done right, requires patience. I didn't need to lash out. That would be too obvious. Instead, I planted seeds, little moments of doubt, hints that something wasn't quite right. One day, I casually mentioned a colleague who had been caught cheating on his wife. I watched her reaction, saw the flicker of something in her eyes, the slight tightening of her grip on her coffee cup, but she quickly masked it, brushed it off with a laugh. People are stupid to risk everything for a fling, she said. The irony wasn't lost on me. I left her to stew in that thought, to wonder if I knew more than I was letting on. But I didn't press. I wanted her to feel safe again, to slip back into her routine of lies and stolen moments. The more comfortable she became, the easier it would be to tear everything away from her. Her career, her reputation, her lover, they were all part of my plan. Each one would fall, one after the other, leaving her with nothing. I've been careful, methodical. I've started sowing discord at her office, planning rumors, making sure her performance at work is scrutinized just a little more closely than before. A well-placed comment to the right person, and suddenly her boss is under investigation for misconduct. She doesn't know it yet, but her world is beginning to collapse piece by piece. And all the while I play the loving husband, supportive, understanding, patient. The mask I wear is flawless, and she's none the wiser. This morning, as she kissed me goodbye and left for work, I noticed a slight tension in her shoulders. Something has changed. She's starting to feel the pressure, though she doesn't know why. I'm not in a rush. There's still more to do, more pieces to move before the final blow. But the game has started, and I'm the one holding all the cards. I've waited, watched, and calculated every step with precision. She's played her part well, but she doesn't realize that this game has never been hers to win. I wonder how long it will take before she understands that every small failure, every misstep, every sudden loss in her life isn't just bad luck. It's me. I let her think she's still in control, but control is something I reclaimed the moment I discovered her betrayal. Now, all that's left is for her to watch her life unravel, thread by thread, until there's nothing left but the ashes of her choices. And when she finally sees the truth, it will be too late. Looking back, I can see when it all started to fall apart, though at the time, I convinced myself everything was fine. It's amazing how many lies we tell ourselves just to keep the peace, to preserve the image of a life we think we deserve. I told myself she was just busy. Everyone gets busy, right? New projects, more responsibility, late nights. It's all part of the package. That's how I rationalized it in the beginning, as her excuses started to stack up. I remember the first night she came home late, really late, and I didn't even blink. She had texted me earlier saying she was stuck in some meeting with her boss, James. The name barely registered with me at the time. I knew of him, of course, but he was just a figure in the background of her work life, someone I didn't pay much attention to. I wasn't suspicious, not then. I'd kissed her when she finally came through the door at almost midnight, her hair a little tousled, her face flushed with what I thought was exhaustion. She smiled at me, and I believed her. But things kept happening, little things that, in hindsight, should have set off alarms. She became more guarded with her phone, always tilting the screen away from me or leaving it face down on the table. And the texts at odd hours from work became more frequent. She would laugh off my questions, brush me away with a kid, well, you know how it is, long hours, deadlines. I believed her because I wanted to. I had no reason not to. We had been solid for years, no major fights, no lingering issues. But then there was that weekend, the one where she was supposed to go on a business trip with a few colleagues. It was just a couple of days, she said, nothing big. She left early on Friday morning, a quick kiss goodbye, her suitcase packed efficiently. I remember joking about how she could fit an entire weekend into such a small bag, and she had laughed. The sound forced now that I think about it. That Saturday I was restless, I don't know why. Maybe some part of me already knew something wasn't right, even if I couldn't put my finger on it. I decided to call her that evening just to check in. When she didn't pick up, I didn't think much of it at first. She was probably at dinner with her colleagues, I told myself. But when an hour passed, then two, and she still hadn't returned my call, I started to feel that cold knot of anxiety tighten in my stomach. It wasn't until the next day, when she finally answered, that something shifted in me. Her voice was off, distracted, and I could hear the background noise. Too quiet for a restaurant, too intimate for a hotel. I asked her about her trip, about the meetings, the clients. Her answers were short, clipped. She didn't elaborate like she usually did, and I caught the slight tremble in her voice when I asked who she was with. Just the usual team, she said, a little too quickly. I didn't press. I didn't need to. Something in her tone had already betrayed her. She returned home on Sunday night, and everything seemed back to normal. She hugged me, kissed me, acted like nothing was different. But I was different. I was watching her now, seeing her for the first time in months, really seeing her. And that's when I noticed all the things I had overlooked before. The way her phone was always close by, how she spent more time at work than she did at home, how she was distant even when she was sitting right next to me. I started paying closer attention to the details. I began cataloging every moment she was late, every unexplained absence. I looked back over the months, tracing the pattern of her deception. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there, hiding in the shadows of our daily life. Then there was the dinner with her colleagues a few weeks after that weekend trip. She had invited me along, probably thinking it would reinforce the lie, make everything seem normal. I went playing the part of the supportive husband. We were at a nice restaurant, her coworkers all gathered around the table, laughing and drinking. And that's when I saw him, James, her boss. He was charming, friendly, the kind of guy who had everyone's attention. But it wasn't his charm that caught my eye. It was the way he looked at her, and more importantly, the way she looked at him. For just a moment, they forgot I was there. I watched as their eyes met across the table, a look that was too familiar, too comfortable, too intimate. I didn't react. I just sat there sipping my wine, letting the realization sink in. It was real. It wasn't just in my head. That look, that connection, was all the confirmation I needed. I wasn't some paranoid husband jumping at shadows. This was real. Over the next few days, I became obsessed with finding proof. I needed something tangible, something undeniable. I started checking her phone when she wasn't around, scrolling through her messages, her emails. She was careful, but not careful enough. I found the texts, the ones that weren't meant for my eyes. They were vague, but the meaning was clear. Meetings that weren't meetings, excuses that were just covers for their time together. I remember the moment it all came crashing down. It was late at night and she was asleep beside me. I had her phone in my hand, scrolling through a conversation with James, my stomach tightening with every message. They were planning another trip, another weekend together. The words blurred in front of my eyes, my heart pounding in my chest, but I didn't feel anger. Not yet. What I felt was cold, calculated clarity. I put her phone back on the nightstand and lay there, staring at the ceiling. My mind was racing, but my heart was calm. This wasn't a moment for rage or confrontation. No, I needed to think, to plan. The realization that my wife had been living a lie for months should have devastated me. But instead, it sharpened me, focused me. She had betrayed me, and now it was my turn to betray her. In the days that followed, I watched her even more closely, but she had no idea. She was too confident, too sure of her ability to keep her secret hidden. She smiled at me, kissed me goodbye in the mornings, told me she loved me, but I knew better now. Every word out of her mouth was just another part of the lie. James, too, became part of my surveillance. I started researching him, digging into his background, learning everything I could about him. He was successful, respected, a rising star in his field. But no one is perfect, and no one is untouchable. It didn't take long to find the cracks in his armor, past indiscretions, whispers of misconduct that never made it to the surface. He thought he was untouchable, but I would change that. By the time I was ready to take my first steps toward revenge, I had built an entire timeline of their affair. I knew when it started, where they met, how they hid it from me. I had all the pieces, and now it was time to start pulling them apart one by one. I didn't confront her, not yet. There was no point. She would deny it, make excuses, maybe even try to spin it back on me. No, I wouldn't give her that chance. Instead, I would let her life unravel slowly, just like she had unraveled ours. And when she finally realized what was happening, it would be far too late. I started with subtle steps, the kind that would be nearly impossible for her to trace back to me, not at first. Sabotage is most effective when it's indistinguishable from bad luck. At first, it was the little things, minor inconveniences at work, delays, miscommunications with colleagues that had her stressing, second-guessing herself. I knew exactly how her office functioned, and I knew exactly how to twist the gears in ways she wouldn't notice until the damage had already been done. I'd planted seeds of doubt in her professional life with just a few well-placed words. An offhanded conversation with one of her coworkers at a company function, one where I mentioned her late nights at the office, joking that she never seemed to leave. The look in their eyes told me I had struck the right chord. I knew the office politics well enough. I knew how stories spread, how rumors grew. A few whispers about her relationship with her boss would be enough to cast shadows over her reputation, and I made sure those whispers started exactly where they would do the most damage. Within a week, she began coming home a little more flustered. Small signs at first, a nervous laugh here, a quick dodge when I asked her how work was going. I could tell the office tension was beginning to weigh on her. She mentioned things were stressful, that James, her boss, was acting differently, more distant. That's when I knew the rumors had started to fester. They would take their time working their way through the company, but soon enough, people would start talking. Speculation like wildfire spreads fast. I could have stopped there, let her work life crumble under the pressure, but that was only the beginning. Her relationship with James, the man she was sneaking around with, had to suffer too. If I was going to pull this off, I needed to dismantle her world piece by piece. His career was the next domino I needed to topple. James wasn't as clean as he liked to present himself. No one in his position ever is. A little research led me to a couple of complaints filed against him over the years. Nothing that ever stuck, of course. He'd managed to keep his record clean on paper, But there were enough skeletons in his closet to build a case if someone pushed hard enough. And I was going to push. I anonymously sent tips to the HR department and board members about those complaints. I included specific details, enough to make sure they would take a second look at his behavior. I crafted it carefully, not blatant accusations, but just enough doubt to make them want to dig deeper. The weight of it would be gradual, an investigation that started quiet, but would grow in intensity over time. James would be distracted, off his game, and soon enough, he'd have his own career to worry about. While this was playing out behind the scenes, I continued to watch her unravel. It was fascinating to see how quickly the pressure was getting to her. Her confidence was faltering, her perfect image of control slipping. She thought she was so clever, managing her affair without raising suspicion. But now she was making mistakes, careless ones. She started snapping at me over minor things, little arguments that had no substance but revealed her state of mind. I stayed calm, played the part of the supportive husband, letting her vent. But inside I was smiling. She had no idea how deep in the quicksand she was. The beauty of it all was that she couldn't talk to anyone about what was happening. She couldn't explain to James why her work life was suddenly spiraling out of control. She couldn't confess to her friends why her relationship with him was suddenly strained. Every step it took to dismantle her world was wrapped in her own silence, her own need to keep everything hidden. The isolation was setting in. I could see it in the way she carried herself, a little more hunched, a little less confident. One night after a particularly stressful day at work, she came home looking worn. I could tell she'd been crying, but she masked it with a smile when I asked how her day went. "Just tough," she said, brushing it off like usual. But her eyes lingered on me a little longer than normal, like she was waiting for something, maybe an outburst or a fight. Instead, I kissed her forehead and told her everything would be fine. I was patient. Her work situation was deteriorating as planned, but I wanted to draw this out a little longer, see how much more she could take. Meanwhile, I kept myself busy by tightening the noose around James's career. It wasn't long before I heard from her that James had been placed under investigation for inappropriate conduct. She seemed shocked, almost defensive when she mentioned it, but she didn't connect it to anything other than bad timing. Of course, she had no idea how far I'd gone to make sure it was more than just bad timing. As the investigation into James deepened, their affair started to show cracks. She wasn't able to lean on him the way she used to. His attentions were elsewhere, focused on saving his career. Their stolen moments became fewer and more frantic, and I knew the tension would eventually snap. I had anticipated this part, anticipated that when things got rough, their relationship would buckle under the weight. I just had to wait for the breaking point. It came sooner than expected. I overheard them fighting over the phone one evening when she thought I was asleep. It was muffled, tense, her voice rising in frustration while she hissed accusations at him, and I couldn't hear his responses, but I could imagine the panic in his voice. She accused him of pulling away, of using her, of only caring about himself. The irony wasn't lost on me. That night, she lay in bed beside me, staring at the ceiling, her breathing shallow and strained. I wondered if she realized how far out of control things had gotten. I wondered if she ever thought about the consequences, if she could see how quickly everything was unraveling. But still, she kept up the facade during the day, pretending everything was fine, going through the motions as if nothing was wrong. It was impressive in its own way, how deeply she could deny the truth to herself. I waited for the perfect opportunity to push things over the edge, to take the final steps toward dismantling her life. I wanted the last blow to be public, something that would leave no room for her to recover. But it had to be the right moment. That moment came when she told me about a major project at work, one that could potentially save her career if she handled it right. I had been laying the groundwork for this for weeks, and now it was time to strike. She was so focused on this project, so determined to prove herself, that she didn't notice the traps I'd set. A few discreet calls to the right people, a few sabotage connections, and suddenly her project was on the brink of failure. The fallout would be disastrous for her reputation, her career. And the best part? She wouldn't be able to blame anyone but herself. The night before her big presentation, I watched as she worked late into the night, poring over her notes, her eyes red and puffy from lack of sleep. She looked desperate, clinging to the hope that this project would save her. I let her believe that it would make the fall that much harder. The next day, I made sure everything fell apart. I watched from a distance as she walked into the meeting, confident, unaware that the ground beneath her feet was about to give way. It didn't take long. Within minutes, I could see the panic in her eyes as things started to go wrong. The presentation files were corrupted, the data was incomplete, and key contacts she relied on were suddenly unavailable. Her boss looked on with disdain. Her colleagues whispered among themselves, and she stood there, helpless, watching everything collapse around her. She came home that night, her face pale, her eyes hollow. She didn't say a word as she walked through the door, heading straight to the bedroom. I didn't follow her. I didn't need to. I knew what had happened. I had orchestrated every moment of it. That night, I could hear her crying in the bathroom, the sound muffled behind the door. I sat in the living room, staring at the wall, feeling a strange sense of satisfaction wash over me. This was what I had wanted. This was what I had planned for. Every piece had fallen into place exactly as I had intended. And yet, there was something hollow about it, something unsatisfying in the way it all played out. She was broken, and yet I didn't feel the triumph I had expected. I pushed the thought aside. There was still more to come. She hadn't hit rock bottom yet, but she was close. And when she finally did, when she had nothing left, I would be there to deliver the final blow. It was a single text message that shattered the illusion, a brief exchange that should have meant nothing, but it broke everything. I had spent years building a life with her, years of trust, commitment, and love, and in one moment I saw the cracks beneath the surface. I found it by accident, like so many things in life, during a quiet Sunday morning when she left her phone on the counter. It buzzed, and without a second thought, I glanced at the screen. There it was, her lover's name, James. Just one sentence, simple and cryptic. Same place tonight. The kind of message someone sends when they know their partner will understand without further explanation. My heart froze, my brain refusing to connect the dots at first. I stood there, staring at the phone, the words blurring as my vision sharpened into a tunnel of clarity. And in that moment, I realized that every doubt I had buried, every suspicion I had dismissed, was true. I didn't confront her then. I couldn't. I wasn't ready for that kind of explosive reality to come crashing down on both of us. Instead, I put her phone back where she left it, my hands shaking slightly. I returned to my coffee, pretending I hadn't just glimpsed the unraveling of our life together. She walked in moments later, smiling, unaware that the foundation beneath her feet had just shifted forever. I smiled back, as if nothing had changed, but everything had. The hours after that were a blur, my mind racing as I replayed every little moment that suddenly took on new meaning. The late nights, the work trips, the quick glances at her phone, and how she seemed to turn away when I entered the room. I felt stupid for not seeing it sooner, for allowing myself to be blindsided by someone I thought I knew better than anyone in the world. But anger didn't consume me, not yet. Anger is dangerous. It clouds your judgment, makes you impulsive, reckless. And I couldn't afford to be any of those things. Instead, I forced myself to think, to breathe, to let the weight of this discovery settle over me like a cold, heavy blanket. I needed to approach this logically, methodically, like any other problem I've solved in my life. I would not be a victim, and I would not be a fool. I began with her phone. It wasn't hard to guess the passcode, her birth year, an almost laughable lack of creativity for someone living a double life. I scrolled through her messages, piecing together the timeline of her affair. It hadn't been going on for long, a few months at most, but the intensity was obvious. The texts were careful, vague, but there was no mistaking the intimacy. The affair wasn't some casual fling. It had depth, a secret life lived behind the guise of her late meetings and weekend work trips. Each message I read sent another surge of ice through my veins, not because of the words themselves, but because of the effortless way she lied. The ease with which she deceived me. I had to remind myself to remain calm, to not let my emotions take the lead. This was just the beginning. I needed more than just anger to fuel what came next. I needed control. I started small. I didn't want her to suspect that I knew anything, not yet. I needed time to plan, to think about how I would dismantle everything she had built in secret. I couldn't just expose the affair. It would be too easy, too quick. She had to feel it, to lose everything as slowly and methodically as I would make it happen. I was patient. I had time. Over the next few weeks, I watched her closer than ever before. I took note of every time she smiled at me with that practiced ease, every time she left for work, and every time she thought she was fooling me. It was almost fascinating to see how far she could go to maintain her facade, how she could come home from a night with him and slip seamlessly back into our life without a hint of guilt. But I wasn't fooled anymore. I was counting every lie, storing it all away for the day I would let it all collapse on her. I kept myself busy during this time. I began digging into her lover's life. James, the successful businessman, the one with the perfect career and apparently no sense of loyalty. It wasn't hard to find his weaknesses. He had skeletons in his closet, just like anyone in his position. I started compiling everything I could on him, his past affairs, whispers of unethical practices at work, and a few financial decisions that bordered on criminal. I wanted leverage, and I was going to use it. I watched as her behavior grew more erratic. The pressure of maintaining her secret was starting to get to her, though she didn't know why. I planted small seeds of doubt in her mind, subtle things that made her question if I suspected something. I mentioned James's name more often, casually, in conversation. I hinted at how hard it must be to work with someone like him, how much time they seemed to spend together. I could see the slight flicker of unease in her eyes when I did, but she covered it well, at least at first. It wasn't long before her life at work started to crumble, just as I had planned. James's reputation took a hit, thanks to the anonymous tips I had sent to the higher-ups in his company. There were whispers of misconduct, nothing that could be proven outright, but enough to start a full-scale investigation into his practices. The company couldn't afford the scandal, so they quietly pushed him aside, limiting his responsibilities while they sorted things out. This, of course, had a ripple effect on her. Without James protecting her, her position became more precarious. She was talented, but in an environment like hers, office politics played just as big a role as competence, and without her ally, she was vulnerable. Her projects began to falter, deadlines were missed, and she found herself increasingly isolated. I made sure of that, dropping small hints to her coworkers about her relationship with James, never outright accusations, just enough to make them wonder, to make them treat her differently. At home, I continued to play the role of the supportive husband. I listened when she vented about her problems at work, nodded sympathetically when she complained about how unfair things had become. She had no idea that I was the one pulling the strings, orchestrating her downfall from the shadows. It was satisfying in a way I hadn't anticipated. Watching her life unravel piece by piece, knowing that I was in complete control, gave me a sense of power that I hadn't realized I craved. The breaking point came when she came home one evening, late again, and I could see the weariness in her eyes. She had been to see James, I knew it without her saying a word, but something was different this time. There was no spark left in her, no excitement about the secret life she had been living. Instead, there was only exhaustion, a kind of hollow look that told me she was starting to realize just how far things had spiraled out of control. She sat down at the kitchen table without a word, her head in her hands, and for a moment, I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. But then I reminded myself of the lies, the betrayal, and any sympathy I might have felt disappeared. This was what she deserved. This was what I had planned for. I sat across from her, watching as she struggled to compose herself. Finally, she looked up at me, her eyes red and puffy. "I don't know what's happening," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Everything is falling apart." I leaned back in my chair, feigning concern. "What do you mean?" She shook her head, unable to articulate the chaos swirling around her. "Work, James. I don't know. It's all just Just what? Asked, pushing her gently, wanting her to say it, to admit it. Everything is going wrong, she whispered, tears welling up in her eyes. I looked at her for a long moment, letting the silence stretch between us. This was it, the moment I had been waiting for. I could feel it hanging in the air, the weight of her despair pressing down on her. Maybe it's not just bad luck, I said quietly, leaning forward. Maybe you've made some choices that are finally catching up with you. Her eyes widened slightly, a flicker of panic crossing her face. What do you mean? I smiled, but it didn't reach my eyes. You think I don't know, Lady? I asked, my voice low, controlled. You think I haven't noticed the late nights? The lies? Her breath hitched, her face going pale. She tried to speak, but no words came out. I stood up slowly, walking around the table until I was standing behind her. I could feel her trembling slightly, the fear finally sinking in. I know everything, I said softly, leaning down so my words were just inches from her ear. I've known for a long time. The room was silent except for the sound of her shallow breathing. She didn't move, didn't say a word, as the reality of her situation settled over her like a suffocating weight. I straightened up, my heart pounding in my chest, but outwardly I was calm, composed. This was just the beginning. The final act hadn't even started yet. The days that followed my quiet revelation to her were a study in controlled chaos. She thought she could still maintain the threads of her crumbling world, patch things up, salvage the pieces that were slipping through her fingers. I could see it in her eyes each morning, the desperate search for solutions that didn't exist. But every move she made only deepened the cracks, pulling her further into the quicksand. She didn't connect any of it to me. Why would she? I had spent years playing the role of the patient, devoted husband. She had taken my kindness, my stability, as a given. I was the rock she never noticed until it was too late. And now that rock was pulling her under. It was almost too easy to push her deeper into the abyss. At work, the fallout from James's investigation intensified. I had made sure that the accusations, though initially vague, carried enough weight to warrant serious scrutiny. He was losing his grip on the company, and without his protection, my wife's position grew more precarious by the day. I watched her attempt to salvage her reputation, but the whispers in the office had already taken root. I'd spoken to the right people, planted the right doubts. She had no idea where the poison had come from, but it was spreading faster than she could manage. At home, things were different. Our conversations became increasingly stilted, a strained civility masking the tension. She tried to carry on as if nothing had changed between us, offering shallow explanations for her late nights and distant stares, but I didn't push her. I wanted her to feel the weight of her deception without fully understanding what was happening. I wanted her to wonder if I knew, to second-guess every word she said to me. That it was part of the game. One evening she came home looking more exhausted than I'd ever seen her. She dropped her bag by the door and collapsed onto the couch without a word. I could hear her breathing, slow and uneven, as if she were struggling to keep herself from breaking apart. I sat across from her, silent, waiting. She didn't look at me for a long time. When she finally did, her eyes were red, swollen from hours of crying, but her face was set in a grim, determined expression. "They've suspended James," she said quietly. I nodded, as if this were news to me. "Why?" "There's an investigation into his behavior," she whispered, barely getting the words out. "They're saying he crossed lines, that there were inappropriate relationships with people at the company." She couldn't even look at me as she spoke, her shame practically palpable. She didn't have to say it. James had crossed those lines with her, and now she was drowning in the consequences of it. "What does that mean for you?" I asked, keeping my voice calm, neutral. Her eyes flickered with something. Fear, maybe. She was too smart not to know what this meant. With James out of the picture, her own position was vulnerable. The people who had tolerated her late nights and special treatment wouldn't hesitate to throw her under the bus now. She had no real allies, no safety net. "I don't know," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I don't know what's going to happen." I leaned back in my chair, watching her unravel. This was what I had been waiting for, the moment when everything she had built came crashing down and she had no one left to turn to. The satisfaction I thought I'd feel was there, but it was tempered by something else, something more hollow. I had won, but the victory felt incomplete. I decided it was time for the final blow. A week later, I set the last phase of my plan in motion. I knew my wife had been called into a meeting with the senior executives at her company to discuss her involvement with James. They hadn't outright accused her of anything yet, but they were suspicious, and they were looking for answers. I made sure they would get exactly what they needed. The night before her meeting, I sent an anonymous email to the head of HR, attaching copies of her text messages with James. They weren't explicit, but they were enough to raise questions, enough to confirm what everyone had been whispering about. I timed it perfectly so that when she walked into that meeting, the evidence would be fresh in their minds. The fallout was immediate. By the end of the day, she was placed on indefinite leave pending further investigation. The humiliation was written all over her face when she came home that night. She didn't say a word to me, didn't even acknowledge my presence as she walked past me, straight to the bedroom. I heard her sobbing quietly behind the door, but I didn't follow her. There was nothing left to say. The next few days were a blur of desperation on her part. She reached out to old contacts, tried to salvage what little credibility she had left, but it was too late. The stain of her affair with James had tainted everything. She was toxic now, radioactive. No one wanted to be associated with her. It was strange watching her spiral. In some ways, she reminded me of a caged animal, frantic and helpless, lashing out at anything that came near. But the walls were closing in, and there was no escape. She had no great job, no reputation, and no future in the industry she had worked so hard to climb. And worst of all, she had no idea how it had all come crashing down so quickly. I could have ended it there, but I wanted her to understand. I wanted her to know that everything that had happened to her was because of me. She needed to know that her betrayal hadn't gone unnoticed, that I had orchestrated her downfall with the same precision and patience she had used to deceive me. One evening, when the silence between us had become unbearable, I sat down across from her at the dinner table. She looked up at me, her eyes empty, hollowed out by the weeks of torment. There was no fight left in her, no defiance, just a said broken resignation. I know, I said softly. She blinked, confused. What? I know about you and James, I continued, my voice steady. I've known for a long time. The color drained from her face, and for a moment, she looked like she might pass out. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. She just stared at me, her eyes wide with shock, with the dawning realization that everything she had tried so desperately to hide was now laid bare. How long? She finally whispered. Since the beginning, when I said, leaning forward. I saw the text messages. I knew about the meetings, the late nights, all of it. Her hands trembled as she reached for her glass of water, her throat dry. Why didn't you say anything? I smiled, but there was no warmth in it, because I wanted you to feel it. I wanted you to watch everything you've built fall apart, just like you did to us. Tears filled her eyes as she stared at me, and for the first time in weeks, I saw real fear in her. She wasn't just afraid of losing her job or her reputation, she was afraid of me. You did this? She asked, her voice barely audible. I nodded. I did, every piece of it. James's investigation, the whispers at work, the texts, it was all me. She collapsed into sobs, her body shaking with the weight of everything I had just told her. I watched her for a moment, feeling the satisfaction of seeing her finally understand the depth of her betrayal and the consequences that had come from it. But as I sat there watching her break apart, that hollow feeling returned. I had won. I had destroyed her, just as I had planned. But as I looked at her, a shattered shell of the woman I had once loved, I realized that my victory was empty. Revenge hadn't brought me the closure I thought it would. It hadn't healed the wounds of her betrayal. If anything, it had only deepened them. She sobbed for what felt like hours, and when she finally stopped, there was nothing left between us. Just silence. a vast chasm of pain and loss that couldn't be bridged. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice hoarse and broken. "I'm so sorry." But it didn't matter. Her apology came too late. There was no fixing what had been shattered. I stood up from the table, the weight of everything pressing down on me. I had won, but the victory tasted bitter. I left her there, alone in the kitchen, and walked out into the night, the cold air biting at my skin. For the first time since this all began, I wasn't sure if it had been worth it. It had been months since I first discovered the affair, and now, sitting in the quiet of the kitchen, I found myself reflecting on how everything had led to this. The details that once seemed insignificant now stood out like neon signs, flashing warnings I had ignored. I could see it all so clearly, the way she had expertly lied to my face, how she had twisted our conversations to keep me in the dark, and how I had chosen to trust her when I should have questioned every word. I remember the first time she lied about James. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but I could feel the shift in her tone. We had been sitting at this very table, her telling me about a late meeting, the way her eyes flickered toward her phone just a moment too long. At the time, I had let it slide, dismissing it as work stress. But now, as I think back, I realize it was the beginning of something much deeper, a chasm between us that I hadn't been able to see then, but which had grown into an abyss. I think about the night I found the messages. I hadn't been looking for them. She had left her phone on the counter while making coffee, the soft buzz of an incoming text catching my attention. I wasn't the kind of person to snoop, but something in me that morning had urged me to check, just once. And there it was, the message from James, her boss, asking her to meet him at the usual place. The casualness of it had hit me hardest, like it was routine, like their affair had become part of her day-to-day, something I wasn't supposed to notice. But I had, I noticed everything after that. The months following that discovery were a blur of planning, calculating every move. I had vowed not to confront her immediately. Confrontation would have been too easy, too messy. No, I needed time. Time to carefully unravel everything she had built, the lies she had so expertly woven into the fabric of our life together. I didn't just want her to hurt. I wanted her to feel the full weight of her betrayal, to watch as everything she valued fell apart around her, piece by piece. The things I had done since then, in the shadows of her obliviousness, now felt like a blueprint of destruction. I had carefully planted rumors at her workplace, whispers of her involvement with James, the same man now under investigation for misconduct. I watched as her confidence at work slowly eroded, as she struggled to maintain her standing amidst the growing scrutiny. She never suspected me. How could she? I was her rock, her constant. I had played the role so well. In those moments, I felt powerful, in control. Every time she came home late again, with that guilty look in her eyes, I knew she was digging her own grave without realizing it. I had waited patiently, timing each move, each small sabotage, so that when her world finally collapsed, there would be no one to blame but herself. I remember the night when it all fell apart for her. She had walked through the door, her face pale, her hands trembling. I had known then that she had been called into the office, confronted with the allegations surrounding her and James. I could see the fear in her eyes, the panic she tried so hard to hide. But she didn't say a word to me. She still thought she could control the narrative, that somehow she could fix everything without me knowing. It was almost pitiful to watch her try, but I didn't feel pity. I felt satisfaction. As I sit here now, months after the final blow, I replay the last conversation we had before everything came crashing down. She had been in denial, even when it was clear that her career was over, that her reputation was ruined. She had tried to salvage what was left of her life, but by then, it was too late. She had already lost everything. I think back to the moments when I could have stopped it all, when I could have simply told her I knew, confronted her with the truth, and watched her crumble under the weight of her guilt. But that would have been too easy. I didn't just want her to confess. I wanted her to suffer, to feel the slow, creeping realization that every misstep, every mistake, had been orchestrated by me. I wanted her to see me not as the passive husband she had deceived, but as the architect of her destruction. And she did. When I finally revealed everything, the text messages, the rumors at work, the investigation into James, it was as if the ground beneath her feet had vanished. She had stared at me, wide-eyed, like a child caught in a lie. But this was no minor transgression. This was her entire life unraveling before her eyes, and I was the one pulling the threads. Her reaction had been predictable. She cried, begged for forgiveness, promised that it had meant nothing, that she would do anything to fix it. But I wasn't interested in her apologies. They were hollow, coming too late to make any difference. Her tears didn't move me. In fact, they only solidified what I had known all along, that she was weak, that she had always been weak, and that I had been the one in control from the very beginning. In the days following my confession, I watched her deteriorate. She stopped going to work. Not that it mattered anymore. She barely left the house, barely spoke to me. The weight of her guilt was suffocating her, and for a while I reveled in it. I had won. I had destroyed her just as thoroughly as she had destroyed our marriage. And yet, the victory felt empty. As I sit here now, I realize that what I had hoped for, some sense of closure, of satisfaction, has eluded me. Yes, I had executed my plan perfectly. Yes, she was broken, her life in ruins. But I hadn't anticipated the toll it would take on me. Watching her suffer didn't heal the wounds she had inflicted on me. If anything, it had deepened them, made them more raw, more painful. I had spent so much time focused on destroying her that I hadn't considered what would be left of me once it was done. The truth is, I had become as consumed by the affair as she had. It had eaten away at me, turned me into someone I didn't recognize. The man I was before, the one who trusted her, who loved her, was gone. In his place was someone cold, calculating, and empty. I had built my entire existence around this plan for revenge, and now that it was complete, I didn't know who I was anymore. The final act of revenge wasn't about her. It was about me, about reclaiming the power I thought I had lost. But in the process, I had lost something far more valuable, myself. I had allowed her betrayal to define me, to dictate every action, every thought. And now, with nothing left to fight for, I am left with the bitter taste of victory, wondering if it was all worth it. I think back to the beginning, to the moment I found the text messages. What if I had confronted her then? What if I had demanded the truth instead of quietly plotting her downfall? Would things have been different? Would we have found a way to repair the damage, to rebuild the trust that had been shattered? I don't know, and that uncertainty haunts me. In the end, I didn't just destroy her life, I destroyed my own. The revenge that I had so carefully crafted, that I had poured all my energy into, had left me with nothing but a hollow shell of the man I once was. I had thought that by controlling the situation, by orchestrating her demise, I would feel empowered, vindicated. But instead, I feel lost. She's gone now. She left not long after our final confrontation. I didn't stop her. I didn't try to keep her from walking out the door. There was nothing left to say, nothing left to salvage. We had both played our parts, and now the stage was empty. As I sit here, alone in the quiet of the house we once shared, I realize that the greatest betrayal wasn't hers. It was mine. I had betrayed myself by letting the affair consume me, by allowing it to dictate the course of my life. I had become the very thing I despised, deceptive, manipulative, and empty. In the end, I got what I wanted. I destroyed her. But at what cost? The man who once loved her, the man who once trusted her, is gone. And I'm not sure he's ever coming back. She left without saying goodbye. I didn't stop her. I watched from the window as she walked down the driveway, suitcase in hand, shoulders hunched in a way that made her look smaller than I had ever seen her. There was no fight left in her, no words of apology or explanation. She was leaving because there was nothing left for her here. No career, no reputation, no marriage. For a moment, I thought about calling out to her, about ending it all with a simple final conversation. But what would I have said? There was nothing to be said. I had accomplished what I set out to do. Her life was in ruins. The woman who had once stood tall and proud, confident in her deception, was now a ghost of herself. I had won, hadn't I? As her figure disappeared from view, a strange sense of finality washed over me, but it wasn't the feeling of victory I had imagined. It was hollow, empty. I sat back in the quiet house, the same house where everything had started. The walls, once filled with her laughter and the hum of normalcy, now felt oppressive. I had thought that once she was gone, once she was out of my life for good, I would feel lighter, free. But instead, I felt weighted down, burdened by the enormity of what I had done. I had destroyed her, yes, but in doing so, I had destroyed something within myself as well. I had been so focused on executing my plan, on dismantling her life, that I hadn't stopped to consider the cost. Not the cost to her, I didn't care about that, but the cost to me. The version of myself that had existed before all of this, the man who had loved her, who had built a life with her, was gone. I had become someone else, someone colder, more calculating, someone who thrived on control and manipulation. And now, without her to destroy, without her to focus my anger on, what was left? The quiet gnawed at me. I replayed the last few months in my mind, every step I had taken to bring her down. I thought about the satisfaction I had felt with each small victory, each time I saw the cracks forming in her perfect facade. But now those victories seemed pointless. I had achieved my goal, but I hadn't anticipated the aftermath. I hadn't anticipated what it would feel like to sit in this house, alone with nothing but the knowledge that I had won. What does it mean to win when the prize is nothing but ashes? I stood up and wandered through the house, my footsteps echoing in the empty rooms. Her things were still scattered throughout. The coat she always left draped over the chair, the book she had been reading stacked on the nightstand, the framed photos of us together that now felt like relics of another life. I picked up one of the photos, studying it. In it, we were smiling, happy, oblivious to what would come. It felt like looking at strangers. I couldn't remember the last time I had felt like the man in the photo. I set it down and walked into the kitchen, where the remnants of our final conversation still hung in the air. I could see her sitting there across from me, the moment I told her I knew about the affair. The shock, the disbelief in her eyes as I revealed every detail of my plan. She hadn't expected it. She had thought she was the one in control, that she could keep her secrets hidden forever. But I had been one step ahead of her the whole time, and now she was gone, and I was alone with my victory. But it didn't feel like a victory anymore. It felt like a hollow, bitter end to a story that had spiraled far beyond anything I could have predicted. I poured myself a drink, the burn of the whiskey doing little to numb the thoughts swirling in my mind. What was I supposed to do now? I had spent so long plotting my revenge, consumed by the need to make her pay, that I hadn't thought about what came after. I hadn't thought about what life would look like once she was out of it. I looked out the window, the night stretching out in front of me, dark and endless. There was nothing left to fight for, nothing left to destroy. I had torn down everything, and now all that remained was the aftermath, the consequences of my own actions. Was it worth it? The question echoed in my mind, relentless. I wanted to say yes, to convince myself that all the pain and effort had been justified, that I had done what needed to be done. But deep down, I knew the truth. Revenge hadn't given me the closure I thought it would. It hadn't healed the wounds of betrayal. It had only deepened them, left me standing here, in the wreckage of both our lives, wondering if there had been another way. I drained my glass and set it down on the counter, staring at the empty house around me. The silence was suffocating, pressing in on me from all sides. She was gone, but her absence was a presence in itself, a reminder of everything I had lost in the process of destroying her. I had won. But at what cost? As I stood there, the finality of it all settling over me like a heavy fog, I realized that the victory I had fought so hard for had come at a price I hadn't anticipated. I had destroyed her, but in the process, I had destroyed myself as well. And now I was left with nothing but the hollow echoes of a life that once was, and the bitter truth that some battles, even when one leave you more broken than when you started. The house was quiet, too quiet, and I was alone.